Good, good. Glad to hear it. Question today. If you were stranded on a deserted island with one book, what would you want that book to be? Maybe not sure. I think personally, I'd want something long because if I'm gonna be stuck on a deserted island, it's gonna be my only form of entertainment. I want something that takes more than a day to read. 'Cause I'm sure otherwise you'd get bored of it. So yeah, definitely, I'd go for a long book. I don't know, maybe something like All the King's Men. It's a long one. But our game plan for today is to start moving into the executive branch. In particular, this week, we're really going to kind of focus on the presidency. And so today, kind of looking at the requirements and expectations of the presidency, and then also some of the limitations with the 22nd Amendment. But first here, the student question I want to answer today is first, what made them to decide to rotate out the presidency every 4 years? So when someone gets elected as president, they serve a 4-year term. And then if they want to keep being president, they have to run for reelection. And so, what do you guys think? What if we did it differently? What if we just said, hey, when someone gets elected president, they stick around as long as they want until they're done, or I guess die. Um, what might potentially be the issue if we did it that way? If we just said, hey, once someone gets elected as president, they're there as long as they want to be. So sure, yeah, definitely no. One, again, that sounds pretty close to having a king or a monarchy at that point, and especially when the Constitution was written, Americans were not about that. And I would agree, Curtis. It does. It helps reduce the risk of corruption. If someone's there for as long as they want to be, that gives them a lot of time to potentially abuse the power of the presidency. It also denies the American people from being able to change their mind. Maybe someone gets elected president, and then we end up not, agreeing with the job that person's doing as president. So, with the fact that they're only president for 4 years, that gives the American people a chance to reevaluate. Hey, do we want this person to stick around as president, or do we want to try someone new? Um, So those would be some of the reasons. As far as the second question of why hasn't there been a female president in office yet, uh, I'd say a lot of that goes back to history. The fact that in the beginning women did not have the right to vote. That's obviously going to skew election results towards men, and so then that kind of became the expected tradition is that you only had men being president. So a lot of people then kind of assume, well, that must mean men make better presidents. And so it's taken a long time for the country to kind of break down those old historical views. And we're seeing the country make progress. You see more women running for president. You see more women being competitive in running for president. I suspect, within a generation, we will see the country's first female president. But it has ultimately kind of been a slow process. So last week we focused on the legislative branch. We kind of looked at, how does Congress operate? What's the organization behind it? How does it go about making laws? This week we're moving into the executive branch, and we're going to focus first on the presidency. But remember, the president alone is not the executive branch. The president is the head of the executive branch, but again, the executive branch is actually the biggest piece of government. You have all these different agencies and departments that are part of the executive branch, and we'll kind of explore that probably next week. But as a starting point, What to you is the presidency? What does that job include when we talk about someone being president? Just what comes to your mind? So yeah, we often kind of view the president as being kind of this leader for the country. Absolutely. And what does that include? What does that mean when we say, the president leads the country? What might be part of the responsibilities of doing that? I like that idea. Uh, Putting actions into place. It's one thing to make a lot of promises about what you want to do as president, but can you actually carry it out? Can you put policy ideas into action? I'd agree with that. Absolutely. Anything else we can think of that's part of the job of being president? Yeah, good. No, we do kind of view the president as having to be kind of the spokesman for the country, informing the country of, kind of how are things going, what's going on. When the country is in a time of crisis, we oftentimes kind of expect the president to kind of give some sort of speech providing guidance to the country. Absolutely. And so more so tomorrow and Thursday, we'll kind of dig deeper into, what is the job of being president? Because, it's one of those things where we all have a general sense of, the presidency and, viewing the president as being the leader of the country. Uh, but many Americans, we don't actually know the details of what does that job actually include? What does it mean to be president of the United States? And I would argue that's kind of an important question to answer because as voters, we get to decide who the president of the United States is. And it's one of those things of like, well, if you're helping to make that decision, you arguably should kind of know what does the job actually include. But we'll begin first by talking about the requirements to be president of the United States. So the Constitution does spell out some specific requirements, some things a person has to have in order to be eligible to be president of the United States. And I'm not expecting you guys to know these off the top of your head. I just want your thoughts and opinions here as a starting point. If you had to guess, what might you think are some of the requirements to be president of the United States? Excellent, Curtis. That is one of them. There is an age requirement. Specifically, you must be 35 years old in order to be president of the United States. So that is one of the official requirements. Any guesses on what might be some other requirements to be president of the United States? Again, no worries if you're right or wrong. We're kind of just brainstorming ideas here. Excellent. Yeah, the kind of your points together. There is this citizenship requirement. For most people, they meet that requirement by being born in the United States. Technically, you can be born in another country and still be president as long as you were born a U.S. citizen through one of your parents being a U.S. citizen. So we have had a couple of people run for president who were actually not born in the United States. Senators John McCain and Ted Cruz, for example, off the top of my head, I know were both born in other countries, but they had at least one parent who was a U.S. citizen. So by default, they were also born U.S. citizens, even though they were born in a foreign country. But yes, you have to be born a U.S. citizen one way or another in order to be president. There ends up then being one other requirement. You need to have lived in the United States for 14 years. Why might that be a requirement? Why might we expect someone to have lived in the United States for an extended period of time if they're going to be president? Yeah, absolutely, Curtis. It would ultimately be weird if like someone was born in America, but then like their family moved to France and they grew up and they spent their entire adult life in France, and then they like came back to the United States and it's like, okay, I'm going to run for president now. It's like, well, do you even like you haven't even been here? Like, how do you know what's going to be best for America? Um, so yeah, kind of with that idea, that's why we have that 14-year requirement. Now, there are some common things people often think are requirements to be president that aren't. Oftentimes, people think there's an educational requirement that, like, you have to have a college degree in order to be president, uh, and that's not an official requirement under the Constitution. And why might that be important? What potentially might be the issue if the Constitution said you had to have a college degree in order to be president? In what way might we argue that's unfair? Yeah, how come? Why might that be viewed as not being equal? Yeah, because whether we're talking about today or back in the late 1700s, not everyone can afford to go to college. Or people may not have that as a realistic educational opportunity, depending on what their situation is. And so ultimately, we don't want to unfairly discriminate about who could become president of the United States, because the idea is that the voters get to decide who they want to be president. And so if there is someone who is running for president and doesn't have a college degree but seems to have like a really good understanding of the situation and might do a good job as being president, that's up for the voters to evaluate that person. uh, on the same note, there's also not like a background check for being president of the United States. Theoretically, someone could have a history of being a bank robber and get elected to president of the United States. Now, that's probably not likely going to happen because, generally speaking, people don't want to vote for someone with a criminal record. Uh, but officially, there's nothing stopping that person from being elected, because, again, it should be up to the voters to decide if not having a criminal record was a requirement. Government could theoretically easily eliminate anyone from being president by just arresting them and charging them with a crime and giving them a criminal record. It's like, oh well, now you can't be president because you got a criminal record now. So there's nothing like that either. So in terms of the official requirements for being president, it's a short list. As long as you are a natural born citizen of the United States, you're at least 35 years old, and you've lived in the United States for 14 years, you can theoretically become president of the United States. When we look over the history of US presidents, though, we do find some unofficial commonalities. There seem to be some certain expectations among most, if not all, of the presidents. And so, if you had to take a guess, what might be some different characteristics that most, if not all, of the presidents have had in common with one another? So sure, definitely. While theoretically someone can be president at the age of 35, they tend to be older, at least middle aged. If not in their senior years. Um, oftentimes under that assumption that with age comes more experience and wisdom. That's not always the case, but that is often the thought process. Uh, and definitely, Curtis, they do oftentimes tend to be of some sort of higher status, in part because running for president requires a lot of resources. So if you're of higher status, you probably have more connections to help you get your foot in the door of winning an election. We certainly have had presidents that have come from low income or humble backgrounds. People like Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Harry S. Truman. But generally speaking, people who get elected tend to have some sort of higher status in society before they run for president. Anything else you can think of that most, if not all, of the presidents likely had in common with one another? Yeah, no, that's an important one to recognize now. With obviously one exception, Barack Obama. Every U.S. president so far has been white. Um, Again, that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with not having any female presidents. Is historically racial minorities were not able to vote. That's obviously going to tilt the scales towards white people getting elected, and then that kind of sets a historical precedent. And again, it's taken time to chip away at that notion of who in America can be president of the United States. We definitely are seeing more people of different racial backgrounds running for president, and more women running for president. We had the first major gay candidate run for president back in 2020, former mayor of South Bend, Pete Buttigieg from Indiana. So, we're seeing a growing variety in the people running for president of the United States. But in terms of what has been the historical pattern, it has kind of tended to be white men, older white men, who also then either Christian or at least kind of have some sort of belief in a higher power. Some of the older presidents, like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, probably were not explicitly Christian, but they might have identified as being deist, meaning they believe in the idea of a god or a higher power, but really aren't sure on any of the details. But then, especially as we get into kind of more modern U.S. history, from the 1900s onward, presidents have been Christian in one way or another. That's not an official requirement because, again, there's no religious test to serving in the government. But we at least publicly have not had a non-religious president or a president of a minority religion, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, something like that. In addition to that, then, with two exceptions, if I remember correctly, every person who's been elected president either was married, had a wife, or they were married in the past, but the wife might have passed away. Why do you think that's the case? Why might voters seem to prefer electing a president that's married? because obviously that's not an official requirement, but it does seem to be a preference for voters. Definitely, Curtis. One is it oftentimes helps make presidents more relatable, like, oh, the president has a family, I have a family. They're just like me. Um, you know, can make them seem more, relatable, down to earth, trustworthy. So if I remember correctly, James Buchanan and Grover Cleveland are the only two people elected president who were not at all married in any way when they first got elected. But even then, Grover Cleveland then got married while serving as president. And then, with one exception, every person elected president has either had former experience serving in the military and or serving in government in some way, shape, or form, whether that was serving in Congress, serving in another president's cabinet, serving as a governor, um, something like that. Um, and of course, why would that be? Why would we probably expect that pretty much every president has had some former political or military experience before becoming president? Sure, definitely can help their credentials and being viewed as like a loyal, patriotic American, especially serving in the military. Any other thoughts or reasons on why voters might prefer someone with former political or military experience? Definitely, an assumption that they might have a better idea of what they're doing as president. As president, you're in charge of the military and, the executive branch. So having some past experience, in government or in the military, we would often view as, that's probably going to be useful in being president of the United States. Absolutely. Um, this is just a trivia question. It's not going to show up on a test or anything like that. But do either of you know or have a guess who is the only president who had no former political or military experience? Either of you want to take a guess at that one? I see kind of your logic there, Curtis. Maybe thinking younger people, younger presidents may not have had that time to build experience. Let's see here. JFK actually would have had both because he served in the Navy during World War II and then he served in Congress. I believe both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. Um, so Kennedy actually had both military and governing experience. Obama also was a senator before becoming president. He was the senator of Illinois before president. And then FDR was, so he served as assistant secretary of the Navy during the Wilson administration, and then was the governor of New York before becoming president. So the only president who had no previous governing or military experience is actually Donald Trump, because all of his previous work experience was like in business and entertainment. So he would be the only president to have no former political or military experience. Just kind of an interesting trivia fact. All right, so then I want you to kind of take a moment to think about what you think makes someone a great leader. And then what I'd like you to send me as a private chat message is what is a major characteristic you would want to have in a president? And why is that important to you? So there's obviously no one right or wrong answer to this question. I want you to think, in your opinion, what would be most important to you and who you would want to be president of the United States? What is a major characteristic you would want that person to have, and why is that important to you? So take up to 5 minutes to kind of think and send me your thought. Um, we'll kind of check back in here at 2:02 at the latest. All right. So I've got your responses up here on the whiteboard along with a couple from last period, just so you can kind of see what, some other students came up with. But yeah, some really good thoughts here. One thinking about the importance of impact, being able to get things done as president, because certainly there are a lot of presidents who make a lot of promises, who have a lot of goals on things they want to get done. And it's one thing to have that vision, but are you able to put it into reality? Are you able to navigate through, the complications of government, to get those things accomplished? It's tricky to do. A lot of presidents struggle with it. I also love the thought of, needing to have some thick skin. As president, you are going to get criticized. Inevitably, there are always going to be people in the country who think, a president is doing a bad job, or that president is ruining the country, regardless of what the political views may be. So yeah, needing to have some thick skin. If you got a fragile ego, president may not be the best job for a person. Being able to kind of roll with the punches, let things kind of run off you, and kind of focus on doing what needs to get done for the good of the country. Absolutely. Feel free to kind of take a look there and kind of read through what some of the students from last period said as well. But then the last thing we need to talk about today are some limitations on being president of the United States. So, as we've previously talked about, when a person gets elected to president, they're not there for life. They serve a 4-year term. And then at the end of that 4-year term, if they want, they can choose to run for re-election. And historically speaking, presidents served at most 2 terms as president. And then they tended to step down and kind of let someone else, step up and run for president. But originally, that was not a constitutional requirement. So where did that come from? Why only 2 terms? And as with many things tied to the presidency, we can trace it back to George Washington. It was no surprise that after the Constitution was ratified, Washington was elected as the first president of the United States because, again, he was by far the most popular person in America at the time. So he easily wins the presidency. And after serving his first term as president, Washington was kind of thinking about stepping down and retiring. But you had a bunch of people saying, no, you need to stick around. The country needs you. And so Washington said, fine, I'll run for re-election. I'll serve another term as president. But then after that second term, Washington was done. He was ready for retirement. And so he stepped down. Now, had Washington wanted to stick around, he easily would have won re-election. The people would have been happy to keep him around as president. But sometimes this is kind of viewed as being the most important thing Washington did as president. Why? Why might it be good for the country that Washington kind of set this standard that after 2 terms, you walk away from the job of being president of the United States? Definitely, Curtis, because it unofficially set another limit on power. Because again, officially, the Constitution didn't put any limitation in place. But once Washington kind of sets that standard that after 2 terms, you're done, you walk away, future presidents are going to follow that because no one wants to be the guy who goes against George Washington. So Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, so on and so forth. For those presidents that got elected twice, they all stepped down after that second term. The one exception to that is Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, is the only person who was elected to the presidency more than twice. He ultimately was elected 4 times to the presidency. However, he died shortly in his 4th term. And, that was kind of shocking at the time when Roosevelt decided to run for a 3rd term in 1940. Now, his reasoning for doing so was that the world was going through World War II at the time. Roosevelt was concerned that if someone else became president, they might not do what he thought was, a good job of navigating through the challenges of the war. And so Roosevelt felt like he needed to stick around as president to help guide the country through World War II. And so that was ultimately his reasoning for running for a third and fourth term as president. And ultimately, most historians would agree that that worked out for the country, that Roosevelt's generally considered to have done a good job of navigating the country through World War II. He tends to be regarded as one of the better presidents in U.S. history by most. However, in the aftermath of Roosevelt's presidency, that did raise some red flags of, well, what if in the future someone decides they want to stick around and run for reelection and is not good for the country? And so in 1951, the states ratified the 22nd Amendment, which now officially states that a person can only win the presidency twice. And then at that point, you're done. And as we've previously talked about, why do this? It's to limit power. It's to make sure one person can't stick around and become a dictator. Helps, bring new people into the presidency. Hopefully, bringing in some new ideas, to guide the country through new challenges. But every now and then you see some Americans, arguing for getting rid of the 22nd Amendment. Tends to be when a president they like is having to step down after 2 terms. So, for example, back in the 80s, once Reagan was done with 2 terms, you had some people saying, get rid of the 22nd Amendment, let Reagan run for president again. I remember seeing the same thing in 2016 after Obama served 2 terms as president. You had some people, who wanted him to stick around for president. So every now and then you see some people, wanting to get rid of the 22nd Amendment. It's by no means ever a majority of people, but it's something that kind of shows up every now and then. But so nowadays, officially, a president can't serve more than 2 full terms as president. And so that sets up, the different requirements and limitations on the presidency. Tomorrow, then, we'll start digging into the responsibilities of president. What are the different jobs a president is expected to do? So that's where we'll pick up things tomorrow. As always, if you guys have questions or things you want more information on, I'm happy to stick around. Otherwise, you guys are good to go, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.